Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. The scent of river mud hangs thick in the air, mingling with burning cedar resin as we stand in a temple courtyard somewhere in ancient Sumer around 3800 BCE. The sun beats down mercilessly on the ziggurats rising like artificial mountains from the flat Mesopotamian plain, their mud brick facades still damp from yesterday's ritual washing. You can hear the distant murmur of the Euphrates, that life-giving artery that transforms desert into garden, and if you listen closely, the soft scrape of reed styluses against wet clay tablets echoes from the scribal school nearby. This is the cradle of civilization, they tell us in textbooks, but tonight we're here for a different story, one that involves gods descending from the heavens, cosmic labor disputes, and settlement patterns that some researchers insist reveal far more than simple ancient mythology. Before we go any further, I should probably warn you, if you're hoping for a straightforward historical documentary, you probably won't survive this. We're going to wander through mainstream Sumerian scholarship, take delightful detours into fringe interpretations involving ancient astronauts, and somehow end up discussing divine real estate development while you drift off to sleep. It's going to be wonderful and weird and thoroughly relaxing, I promise. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not interested in guilt-tripping anyone into clicking buttons. If bedtime history about potentially extraterrestrial Sumerian gods sounds like your idea of soothing evening content, then welcome home. If not, no hard feelings, and may you find your perfect sleep sounds elsewhere. Also, if you'd like to share where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now, drop a comment. I love knowing that someone in Melbourne might be listening to this at dawn while someone in Chicago is actually using it for its intended bedtime purpose. There's something beautifully connective about sharing these ancient stories across modern time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're standing in the temple complex of Eridu, which the Sumerians themselves considered the first city ever built. Archaeological evidence actually supports that Eridu is indeed one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in southern Mesopotamia, with occupation layers dating back to around 5400 BCE. The temple here, dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, has been rebuilt on the same sacred spot at least 18 times over the millennia, each new structure built directly atop the ruins of its predecessor, creating a layered architectural history you can read like tree rings. The priests move through the courtyard in their white linen robes, which must be absolutely sweltering in this heat, but religious devotion apparently trumps comfort. They're preparing for the evening ritual, arranging offerings of barley bread, dates, and beer on low stone tables. Yes, beer. The Sumerians were passionate brewers, and they offered their gods the same beverage they enjoyed themselves, which seems remarkably practical. Why would the gods want burnt offerings when they could have a nice cold one instead? Though I suppose the beer wasn't actually cold, given the lack of refrigeration, so perhaps it was more of a nice room temperature one, which sounds significantly less appealing but still better than smoke inhalation. According to the clay tablets we'll be examining tonight, actual historical documents preserved for over 4,000 years because someone had the brilliant idea to bake important texts, the Anunnaki were the great gods of the Sumerian pantheon. The term Anunnaki literally translates to something like those who came from heaven to earth or princely offspring, depending on which Assyriologist you ask, and they represented the major deities who governed the cosmos and human affairs. Mainstream scholarship understands them as the divine council, the big decision-makers of the Mesopotamian mythological bureaucracy. They're the gods who determined fates, assigned roles to lesser deities, and generally ran the show from their celestial positions. But here's where our story takes its first delightful detour into fringe territory. Some researchers, most famously Zechariah Sitchin in his Earth Chronicles series from the 1970s onward, interpret these same texts quite differently. Sitchin proposed that the Anunnaki were actually extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold, which they needed to save their planet's atmosphere. When the Anunnaki workers eventually rebelled against their hard labor in the mines, because apparently even advanced aliens hate manual labor, the leadership decided to create a primitive worker species by genetically manipulating existing hominids. That worker species, according to this interpretation, became humanity. Now, before you decide whether to laugh, scoff, or take this seriously, let me just say that the scholarly consensus firmly rejects Sitchin's translations and interpretations. Professional Assyriologists have pointed out numerous errors in his reading of Sumerian grammar and cuneiform signs, but the beauty of bedtime history is that we can explore ideas without necessarily endorsing them, letting them wash over us like warm water while we appreciate the imaginative ambition involved. Plus, the image of alien gods getting into labor disputes is objectively funnier than most divine mythology, so we're keeping it in the mix. The temple complex around us hums with activity, even as the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, painting the mud brick structures in shades of amber and rose. Scribes hurry past carrying their tablet cases, probably worried about getting home before dark, because street lighting won't be invented for another few thousand years, and stumbling around ancient Mesopotamia at night sounds like a great way to fall into an irrigation ditch. The air cools slightly, mercifully, and you can smell the evening meal being prepared in nearby homes: more barley, some fish from the river, maybe lamb if someone's family is particularly prosperous. One of the most fascinating mainstream historical facts about the Anunnaki in Sumerian religion is how carefully organized the divine hierarchy was. The texts describe exactly 7 Anunnaki who were judges of fate, and there were 50 great gods in total, with precise rankings and responsibilities. An is the sky god, the ultimate authority. Enlil is the god of wind and storm, executive officer of the universe, if you will. Enki is the god of wisdom, water, and creation, the clever one, the problem solver, the divine engineer. Then you have Ninhursag, the mother goddess, and various other deities controlling everything from grain production to pottery to the beer supply, because someone has to be responsible for these essential elements of civilization. This hierarchical structure mirrors Sumerian society itself, with its kings, priests, administrators, workers, and slaves all occupying specific social positions. The gods, in other words, look suspiciously like a cosmic version of the city-state bureaucracy, which mainstream scholars understand as humans creating gods in their own image, projecting their social structures onto the divine realm. It's a completely reasonable interpretation that explains why ancient gods always seem to organize themselves exactly like the societies that worship them. Greek gods act like Greek aristocrats, Egyptian gods mirror pharaonic authority structures, and Sumerian gods run their cosmos like a well-administered city-state with proper accounting procedures. But our fringe interpreters look at this same organizational structure and ask, what if it's the reverse? What if the Sumerians organized their society to reflect the actual administrative structure of the extraterrestrial beings who established civilization here? What if these weren't metaphorical projections but literal descriptions of a command hierarchy among the Anunnaki settlers? It's a fun inversion of the standard interpretive model, even if it requires ignoring essentially everything we know about how religions develop and mythologies evolve. The head priest emerges from the temple's inner sanctum, and everyone's attention shifts to him immediately. He's an older man, his beard carefully braided and his shaved head gleaming with scented oil that probably costs more than most families earn in a month. In his hands he carries a clay tablet, freshly inscribed with the day's offerings and prayers. You can still see the wet shimmer on the cuneiform impressions, each wedge-shaped mark pressed deliberately into the clay by a reed stylus cut at just the right angle. These tablets are both mundane and miraculous. Mundane because the Sumerians produced them by the thousands for everything from religious texts to beer receipts, and miraculous because they've survived millennia to tell us their stories with remarkable clarity. The priest begins to chant in Sumerian, a language unrelated to any other known language family, which makes it particularly challenging to translate, but also gives it an otherworldly quality perfect for bedtime listening. The words flow like water, full of sounds that feel both alien and somehow familiar, as if they're tapping into something very old in human consciousness. He's reciting a hymn to Enki, praising the god's wisdom and asking for his blessing on the city's water supply, which is both spiritually profound and extremely practical, because without clean water, your ancient city becomes an ancient disease vector pretty quickly. Some scholars debate whether the Anunnaki were originally a distinct group from the Igigi, another class of deities mentioned in the texts, or whether these terms were sometimes used interchangeably depending on the period and region. The Igigi are often described as younger gods assigned to labor tasks, which in the Atrahasis epic leads to their rebellion and the subsequent creation of humanity to take over their work. This is mainstream Sumerian mythology, preserved in multiple tablet copies from different periods, and it's a genuinely fascinating story about divine class warfare, cosmic labor relations, and the origin of humanity as a workforce created to serve divine needs. Now here's where Sitchin and company point excitedly at these texts and say, see, this is a memory of actual events. The Igigi were the worker aliens who rebelled against the Anunnaki leadership, and then the Anunnaki literally created humans through genetic engineering to be their workforce. They read terms like, to mix the clay with the essence of a god, as descriptions of combining human DNA with extraterrestrial genetic material, not as poetic metaphors for divine creation. It's creative, you have to give them that. Whether it's accurate is another question entirely, and the answer from professional Sumerologists is a pretty resounding no, but the enthusiastic reinterpretation has a certain entertaining charm, like watching someone solve a crossword puzzle by writing in completely different words than the actual answers but somehow making them fit the boxes. The evening ritual continues, and temple attendants begin lighting oil lamps around the courtyard, their small flames flickering like earthbound stars. The smell of burning sesame oil mixes with the lingering incense, creating a soporific atmosphere that probably helped ancient worshippers feel closer to the divine realm. Modern researchers would call it atmospheric manipulation for religious experience. Our fringe friends might suggest the Anunnaki taught humans these techniques because the alien visitors themselves used sensory manipulation for some purpose. Either way, you're getting sleepy, and that's the point. Let's talk about the settlement patterns themselves, which will occupy much of our journey tonight. The Anunnaki, according to the texts, established their cult cities at specific locations throughout Mesopotamia. Eridu for Enki, Nippur for Enlil, Uruk for Inanna, also called Ishtar, Ur for Nanna the moon god, and so on. Each major deity had their primary earthly residence, their temple complex where they dwelt among humans and received worship and offerings. These cities really existed. We've excavated them, walked their ancient streets, touched their ziggurat foundations. The archaeological record confirms the temple complexes, the administrative buildings, the residential quarters spreading out from the sacred centers. Mainstream interpretation, these cities developed organically around particularly successful temples, which became economic and political centers as well as religious ones. The temples controlled vast agricultural estates, employed thousands of workers, served as banks and trading centers, and naturally attracted population settlement. The cities grew up around the wealth and organization that temple economies provided. It's solid, evidence-based urban development theory supported by thousands of administrative tablets detailing temple business operations. Alternative interpretation. The Anunnaki deliberately chose these locations for specific reasons related to their extraterrestrial operations, mining sites, transportation routes between settlements, or positions aligned with celestial markers meaningful to their homeworld. The temples weren't just religious buildings, but functional facilities for whatever the Anunnaki were actually doing on Earth, and the cities developed around these installations as human populations grew to serve Anunnaki needs. The precision of temple orientations and the apparent geographic planning across the region supposedly support this reading, though conventional archaeology explains the same features through well-understood ancient surveying techniques and cosmological symbolism. A cool evening breeze finally picks up, carrying the scent of the river marshes where reeds grow thick and waterfowl nest in their thousands. In the distance, you can hear someone playing a lyre, the soft plucking melody drifting through the twilight like a musical whisper. The Sumerians loved music, developed complex musical theory, and would absolutely approve of using their ancient stories as relaxing bedtime content. Or at least I'm going to assume they would, because they've been dead for 4,000 years and can't really object. The cuneiform tablets that preserve these Anunnaki stories for us are small miracles of information preservation. Unlike papyrus or parchment, which decay relatively quickly, baked clay tablets can last essentially forever if they survive being smashed. Entire libraries have been recovered from ancient sites, giving us direct access to Sumerian literature, mythology, administrative records, mathematical texts, medical prescriptions, and yes, beer recipes. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation myth, the descent of Inanna, mathematical problem sets, astronomical observations, king lists going back thousands of years, all pressed into clay and baked hard, waiting patiently in the earth for modern archaeologists to find them, and modern Assyriologists to translate them, and modern insomniacs to fall asleep to them. When you look at a Sumerian tablet, you're seeing the actual object an ancient scribe held in their hands, feeling the same texture of baked clay, seeing the exact impressions they made with their stylus on some specific day over 4,000 years ago. It's an intimate connection across vast time, more direct than almost any other form of ancient evidence. That scribe probably never imagined their work would survive so long, would travel so far, would be read by people who fly through the air and carry the sum of human knowledge in their pockets. Then again, if you believe Sitchin, maybe they did know, because the Anunnaki supposedly told humans that knowledge would be preserved and rediscovered in future ages. But that's getting ahead of our story. The priests complete their evening ritual, the offerings have been presented, and the sacred flame in Enki's sanctuary burns bright and clean. According to belief, the god himself resides within the temple, sustained by offerings and worship, literally present in his earthly house. The temple isn't a symbol of the god's domain, it's his actual residence, his home base in the mortal realm. This concept of divine presence inhabiting specific locations is crucial to understanding Sumerian religion and, by extension, how the Anunnaki settlement pattern functioned within their worldview. Each city flourishes or struggles based on the favor of its patron deity. Nippur, as Enlil's city, holds particular prestige because Enlil is the chief executive of the Divine Council, the one who actually runs day-to-day operations of the cosmos, while An stays in the heavens being the ultimate authority without doing much hands-on work, like a chairman of the board versus a CEO. Control of Nippur and its temple conveys political legitimacy on Mesopotamian rulers throughout history. Kings from various city-states fight to control it, rebuild its temples, leave inscriptions praising Enlil and documenting their pious renovations. The city has no significant defensive advantages and doesn't control vital trade routes, but it has divine prestige, which matters more than strategic geography in this context. Why would extraterrestrial colonizers care about this? Well, according to alternative interpretations, if you're trying to manage a primitive workforce, which is what humanity supposedly is in this scenario, you need to establish control systems. Religion, these researchers argue, was the Anunnaki's management tool, making humans willing workers by framing labor as service to the gods. The settlement pattern, with each city centered on an Anunnaki facility presented as a temple, created a distributed network of control points across the region. It's a fascinatingly cynical reading of religious history that probably says more about modern corporate hierarchies than ancient divine human relations, but it's the kind of cynical that pairs wonderfully with late-night ponderings. The stars emerge in the darkening sky, those same celestial lights that ancient Sumerians observed with remarkable precision. They tracked Venus with such accuracy that their astronomical tablets can be used to date historical events through celestial mechanics. They identified the 5 visible planets, developed the zodiac, created mathematical models for predicting lunar eclipses. This was no primitive stargazing. This was sophisticated mathematical astronomy requiring generational accumulation of data and complex calculation methods. The Mesopotamians were really good at math. They developed the sexagesimal system that gives us 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These weren't simple shepherds telling stories around fires. These were organized civilizations with specialist scholars pursuing systematic knowledge. which makes the question more interesting. How did this level of sophistication develop so quickly? Conventional history shows gradual development from simple farming villages to complex urban civilizations over thousands of years, with each innovation building on previous achievements. Alternative researchers point to the Sumerian king list, which describes immensely long reigns for pre-diluvial kings. We're talking tens of thousands of years for individual rulers, and suggests this reflects confused memories of the very long-lived Anunnaki before the flood, when the human timeline began in earnest. Mainstream scholars understand these enormous numbers as mythological time, as sacred chronology that functions symbolically rather than literally, similar to the extended lifespans in Genesis. Both interpretations deal with the same text, they just disagree radically about what kind of text it is. A temple cat stalks through the courtyard, ignoring the priests entirely, utterly confident in its divine right to go wherever it pleases. Cats in ancient Mesopotamia occupied a respected position, though they weren't quite as deified as in Egypt. This particular cat is probably hunting the mice that inevitably infest grain storage facilities, making it both a religious mascot and a practical pest control solution. The cat doesn't care about Anunnaki settlement patterns or fringe interpretations of ancient texts. The cat cares about mice and comfortable sleeping spots and occasional worship from humans, which seems like a reasonable set of priorities, honestly. As the first section of our journey draws to its close, we've established our setting, introduced our players, and set up the central mystery that will carry us through the night. The Anunnaki, whether gods or aliens or divine aliens, or simply powerful metaphors for natural forces personified, left their mark across the Mesopotamian landscape in a pattern that begs interpretation. The temples rise from the earth like anchors connecting heaven to ground, their settlement locations carefully chosen, their hierarchies precisely organized, their stories preserved in clay for millennia. You're settling deeper into comfort now, the voice of history washing over you like a warm tide, carrying you back through time to this place between rivers where writing was born and cities rose and the gods walked among humans, or so the tablets tell us. The evening breeze cools the temple courtyard, oil lamps flicker their small defiance against the growing dark, and somewhere in the distance, the rivers flow eternal, indifferent to human interpretation, carrying their silt to the sea as they have for millions of years and will for millions more. The morning light strikes the ziggurat of Eridu at precisely calculated angles, illuminating the eastern face while leaving the western side in cool shadow, a daily drama of light and geometry that the temple architects designed with mathematical precision. We're moving forward now through Sumerian history, jumping ahead several centuries to around 2600 BCE, to the early dynastic period when the city-states are fully established and thriving, when the Anunnaki cult cities have grown from ceremonial centers into proper urban complexes complete with markets, workshops, residential districts, and increasingly impressive temple compounds. The settlement pattern is fully realized now, spread across southern Mesopotamia like a sacred constellation mapped onto Earth, each star a city dedicated to its particular divine patron. The administrative tablets from this period are absolutely fascinating, and I mean that with complete sincerity, despite the fact that most of them are about grain distributions and livestock counts. We have temple records that detail every aspect of religious and economic life with bureaucratic thoroughness that would make a modern accountant weep with joy. How much barley went to the temple brewers? Recorded. How many sheep were sacrificed during the New Year festival? Recorded. How much silver did the temple lend to merchant Urnanshi, and what interest rate was he charged? Recorded with witnesses and seal impressions to make it legally binding. The Sumerians were obsessive record keepers, and their obsession gifts us an incredibly detailed picture of daily life in the world's first civilization. Here's a mainstream fact that beautifully illuminates the Anunnaki's role in Sumerian society. The temples functioned as the primary economic engines of their cities. The gods owned vast agricultural estates worked by temple dependents, controlled trade monopolies, operated craft workshops, and employed hundreds or thousands of people in various capacities. The temple of Inanna at Uruk, for instance, controlled enormous wealth and operated what was essentially a state within a state economic system. Workers received rations rather than wages, so much barley per day, some oil, occasionally beer and fish, all carefully calculated based on their position and family size. It's a redistributive economy centered on the god's household, with the deity theoretically owning everything and the priests managing it on the god's behalf. Now, if you're Zechariah Sitchin reading these same administrative texts, you see something different, evidence of the Anunnaki's resource extraction operation. All these careful records of grain, metal, livestock, and labor represent the systematic collection of Earth's resources for Anunnaki purposes. The ration distributions are payment to human workers supporting the extraterrestrial mission. The temples are administrative centers disguised as religious buildings, and the economic system represents a sophisticated management structure for organizing human labor to serve alien needs. It's a corporate interpretation of ancient religion, and whether it's right or wrong, it certainly makes those grain distribution tablets sound more exciting than "temple gave workers their barley rations on schedule." You're walking through the streets of Nippur now, the most sacred city, Enlil's domain. The ziggurat dominates the skyline, its multiple levels ascending toward the heavens, each platform smaller than the one below, creating that distinctive stepped pyramid shape that characterizes Mesopotamian religious architecture. The lowest level is massive, faced with baked bricks that must have cost a fortune since baking bricks requires far more fuel than simply drying them in the sun. Only the most important structures get baked bricks. Everything else makes do with mud brick that slowly erodes and requires constant maintenance. The temple complex is a city within the city, surrounded by thick walls that separate sacred space from profane, with multiple courtyards, administrative buildings, storage facilities, residences for priests, and workshops for craftsmen producing ritual objects. The streets are narrow, winding between mud brick houses that share walls and press close together, creating shaded passages that offer some relief from the brutal heat. You can hear the sounds of daily life: children playing, women grinding grain with stone querns, the rhythmic pounding of someone beating metal in a workshop, merchants arguing about prices in the marketplace. The smell of bread baking mixes with less pleasant odors because sanitation in ancient cities leaves much to be desired. But let's focus on the bread, shall we? The Sumerians made various types of bread, some leavened and some not, flavored with dates or seeds, shaped into different forms for different occasions. The goddess Nidaba oversees grain and scribes because apparently record-keeping and food production are linked in the divine hierarchy, which makes a certain practical sense when you think about how important it is to track food supplies. One of the delicious scholarly debates regarding the Anunnaki involves their relationship to the Igigi, those younger gods assigned to labor tasks. Different periods and different cities use these terms somewhat differently, and there's considerable academic discussion about whether we're looking at distinct divine classes, regional variations in terminology, or an evolving concept that changed over time. The Atrahasis epic, one of the key sources, describes the Igigi laboring for 40 years, or in some translations 40 very long periods, digging canals before rebelling and demanding relief from their toil. The Anunnaki leadership responds by creating humans to take over the hard labor, solving the problem by introducing a new working class. Mainstream interpretation. This is an etiology explaining human existence and humanity's relationship to the gods. Humans are created to serve divine needs, which justifies the religious and social order where people work temple lands, offer sacrifices, and generally support the cult. It's a mythological framework for understanding why humans exist and what their cosmic purpose is, while also naturalizing a socio-economic system where most people labor to support religious institutions. Fringe interpretation. This is a literal description of events where extraterrestrial workers rebelled against harsh conditions, and the leadership responded by genetically engineering a new worker species using local hominids. The 40 years of canal digging represents actual infrastructure projects the Igigi performed before their revolt, and the creation of humanity was a bioengineering solution to a labor shortage. Every element of the myth corresponds to actual historical events, just misunderstood by later generations who no longer remembered the technological context. The sheer confidence required to claim you understand ancient texts better than the scholars who've spent careers studying Sumerian language, culture, and literature is genuinely impressive. It's like claiming you can perform brain surgery because you once watched a medical drama and noticed some things the doctors seemed to miss. But confidence makes for compelling narratives, and compelling narratives make for better bedtime stories than careful academic hedging. So here we are, exploring both interpretations while your eyelids grow heavier and your breathing slows. A merchant caravan is arriving at Nippur's main gate, donkeys loaded with trade goods from distant lands, cedar wood from Lebanon, carnelian beads from the Indus Valley, obsidian from Anatolia. The Sumerians were enthusiastic traders, connecting their civilization to far-flung partners through networks that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Some alternative researchers suggest these trade routes followed paths established by the Anunnaki for their own resource collection, conveniently connecting sites of particular minerals or materials they needed. Conventional archaeology understands these trade routes as developing naturally along the easiest paths between resource locations and consumer markets, shaped by geography, political relationships, and economic incentives. Both explanations account for why trade routes exist where they do. They just differ on who gets credit for planning them. Let's talk about divine real estate development, because the pattern of Anunnaki settlement across Mesopotamia really does show interesting regularities. The major cult cities aren't randomly scattered, they're distributed across the alluvial plain with consideration for water access, agricultural potential, and relative spacing. Eridu in the far south, Ur not far north, Uruk further up, Nippur in the center, Kish to the north. You can almost see the logic of the distribution, ensuring coverage of the whole region without redundant clustering. Conventional urban theory. Cities develop where environmental and economic factors favor permanent settlement. River access for water and transportation, fertile land for agriculture, defensible positions, trade route intersections, these determine where urban centers emerge. The Sumerian cities grew up in locations that made practical sense for supporting large populations, and the religious significance attached to them followed from their success, not the reverse. Alternative theory. The Anunnaki chose these locations first for their operational needs, and human cities developed around the Anunnaki installations. The spacing represents planned coverage of the region. The locations might correspond to geological features relevant to mining or resource extraction, and the entire settlement pattern reflects intelligent design by advanced planners rather than organic urban development. The practical factors that conventional theory emphasizes were consequences of good planning, not causes of city placement. It's worth noting that some alternative researchers get very excited about applying modern geographical analysis to the Anunnaki cities, looking for geometric relationships, measuring distances, seeking alignments with celestial phenomena. They produce impressive maps covered in lines connecting various sites, forming triangles or other geometric shapes that supposedly reveal the master plan. Mainstream archaeologists remain profoundly unimpressed, pointing out that if you have enough points on a map, you can always find geometric relationships between some of them through simple probability, and most of the significant measurements require cherry-picking which sites to include while ignoring others that don't fit the pattern. The temple complex of Enlil in Nippur is bustling this morning with worshippers bringing offerings, priests conducting rituals, scribes recording transactions, craftsmen delivering finished work, laborers hauling materials for ongoing construction projects. The ziggurat is undergoing renovations. It seems like ziggurats are always undergoing renovations, probably because mud brick architecture requires constant maintenance, and because each new ruler wants to prove their devotion by improving the gods' residences. The construction workers are singing a work song to coordinate their efforts, hauling heavy blocks up the ramps, a song about Enlil's greatness that also helps everyone pull together on the count. Among the cuneiform tablets preserved from Nippur are absolutely riveting labor records, and I'm being only slightly sarcastic when I say that. We have texts recording rations distributed to workers, specifying exactly who received what, on which day. 30 female weavers each got 3 liters of barley. The smith received 4 liters plus half a liter of oil. The chief administrator's household got significantly more, because hierarchy must be maintained even in ration distribution. These mundane records tell us precisely how the temple economy functioned, who worked what jobs, what they received in compensation, how the whole system operated on a daily basis. Alternative interpreters look at these same texts and see payroll records for humans working in the Anunnaki operation. The careful tracking shows systematic organization of human labor. The rations represent payment for services supporting the extraterrestrial mission, and the hierarchies reflect actual management structures, not arbitrary social stratification. Every grain distribution tablet is evidence of the ongoing Anunnaki presence directing human activity toward their purposes. It's a very literal reading of economic texts, treating them as transparent records of actual operations rather than as culturally embedded documents that require contextual interpretation. There's something almost charming about the assumption that ancient texts mean exactly what they appear to say on the surface. Modern scholars spend careers learning to read between the lines, understanding cultural context, recognizing literary conventions, distinguishing different types of texts, and the interpretive approaches each requires. The fringe approach often bypasses all that contextual reading and goes straight for surface-level literalism. It says the gods came from heaven, therefore they came from the sky, therefore they were space travelers. It's refreshingly direct, if also profoundly ahistorical and linguistically naive. But it makes the texts accessible to general readers in a way that academic analysis often doesn't, which probably explains the popular appeal. A group of children run past, playing some game involving a ball and much shrieking laughter. Children in ancient Sumer played with toys that would be recognizable today. Balls, dolls, little clay animals. They attended school if their families could afford it, learning to read and write cuneiform through endless repetition of standard texts, copying and recopying until the signs were perfect. The educational tablets that survive show us beginner exercises, intermediate work, and advanced compositions, tracking students' progress through the curriculum. Some students scratched graffiti into their practice tablets, complaining about their teachers, because some things really are universal across time and culture. The Anunnaki, according to the myths, took interest in human affairs and regularly intervened in mortal matters. They chose kings, granted wisdom, punished wrongdoing, rewarded devotion, sent floods, stopped floods, blessed crops, withheld rain when angry, and generally behaved like powerful aristocrats who expected appropriate deference from their subjects. The relationship between gods and humans in Sumerian religion is fundamentally transactional. Humans provide service, worship, and offerings. Gods provide protection, prosperity, and order. It's a cosmic contract, and both parties have obligations. Mainstream view, this transactional relationship reflects how Sumerian society organized itself and projected those organizational principles onto the divine realm. The gods are ultimate patrons, kings are their earthly representatives, and everyone else serves the system in their assigned roles. The mythology reinforces social structure and provides meaning within a hierarchical civilization. Alternative view, this transactional relationship recalls actual interactions between human workers and their Anunnaki directors. The gods demanding service and providing benefits in return reflects real exchanges between an advanced species and their created workforce. The regular interventions in human affairs represent the Anunnaki actually managing their human population, solving problems, maintaining control, ensuring the operation continued smoothly. A priest walks by carrying a clay liver model used for training in divination through hepatoscopy, reading the future in the livers of sacrificed animals. The Mesopotamians took divination very seriously, developing elaborate interpretive systems for reading omens in everything from sheep livers to the flight of birds to the patterns of smoke rising from incense. They compiled enormous reference texts cataloging thousands of omens and their meanings. If the liver shows this feature, expect that outcome. It's pattern recognition pursued with scientific rigor, even if the underlying theory doesn't match our understanding of causation. Some alternative researchers suggest the Anunnaki taught humans divination techniques as a way to introduce decision-making procedures that served Anunnaki purposes. The omens guided human rulers toward choices that benefited the extraterrestrial agenda, creating a subtle control mechanism that worked by making humans think they were discovering divine will rather than being directly ordered. It's a delightfully paranoid interpretation that makes ancient religion into an elaborate manipulation scheme, though it does raise the question of why advanced aliens would bother with such indirect methods when direct orders would presumably be easier. The marketplace hums with commerce, merchants hawking goods, buyers examining merchandise skeptically, prices being negotiated with enthusiastic haggling that suggests this social ritual brings as much satisfaction as the actual transaction. Silver is the standard of value, weighed carefully on balanced scales to ensure fair exchange. The Sumerians developed complex commercial practices, loans, interest, partnerships, contracts, lawsuits over business disputes, creating the world's first commercial economy, complete with bankruptcy procedures and debt forgiveness policies. The Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the earliest law codes, includes provisions regulating everything from murder to property damage to false accusations, establishing standard penalties and legal procedures. Now, here's something fascinating that mainstream and alternative interpretations actually align on. The Anunnaki settlement pattern corresponded to a political as well as religious geography. Each major city had its patron deity, and the political fortunes of cities often tracked with their divine patron status in the pantheon. When Babylon rose to prominence in later periods, Marduk, Babylon's god, was elevated in the myths to become king of the gods, supplanting Enlil. When different cities dominated Mesopotamian politics, their patron deities enjoyed enhanced status in religious texts from those periods. Conventional reading. This shows how religious mythology adapted to political reality, with theological changes justifying and reflecting political developments. The gods didn't actually change status. Human writers adjusted the stories to match and reinforce current power structures. Alternative reading. This shows different Anunnaki factions competing for dominance, with their human city proxies fighting wars that reflected conflicts among the extraterrestrials themselves. When one Anunnaki leader gained power over others, their cult city prospered and their mythological status rose accordingly. The political changes reflected actual shifts in power among the Anunnaki, not just human propaganda. The sun climbs higher, the day grows hotter, and people retreat indoors during the worst heat, emerging again in late afternoon when temperatures become bearable. The Mesopotamian climate hasn't changed much in 4,000 years. Scorching summers, mild winters, occasional devastating floods when the rivers rise unpredictably. Living here requires adapting to harsh conditions, which the Sumerians did with characteristic ingenuity. Irrigation to control water, sun-dried brick architecture that moderates temperature, daily schedules organized around heat, brewing beer partly because beer was safer to drink than water of uncertain quality. If the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials from a different planet, as Sitchin proposes, why would they choose such a challenging environment for their operations? Alternative researchers have answers. The location provided necessary resources, the climate matched their home planet's conditions, or they actually lived in the mountains to the north where it was cooler while maintaining operations in the lowlands. Mainstream scholars don't need to answer this question because they don't accept the premise, but it's worth noting that many details of alternative theories require additional sub-theories to explain away apparent contradictions, creating elaborate structures of speculation built on speculative foundations. The temple workshops are producing votive offerings, small clay figures of worshippers with enormous eyes, hands clasped in eternal prayer, which wealthy individuals commission and place in temples to worship on their behalf in perpetuity. It's outsourcing your religious obligations, which seems remarkably modern in its approach to efficiency. Why spend time personally praying when you can hire a clay representative to do it for you forever? The figures really do have comically oversized eyes, presumably to better watch for the god's presence, and they range from crude simple forms that common people could afford to elaborate detailed pieces that showcase the donor's wealth and piety. Among the thousands of economic tablets are some absolutely riveting pieces about temple breweries, because the Sumerians loved beer enough to make it a significant part of temple production. The goddess Ninkasi oversees beer making, and a hymn to Ninkasi survives that is simultaneously a religious praise poem and a recipe for brewing beer, describing each step of the process in poetic language. Archaeologists have actually used this hymn to recreate Sumerian beer, discovering it was thick, somewhat sweet, consumed through straws to avoid the debris floating in it, and definitely alcoholic. The temple breweries produced enormous quantities, distributing it as rations to workers, offering it to gods, and probably enjoying some themselves because working in Bronze Age Mesopotamia without beer would be unnecessarily harsh. Alternative interpreters have had their fun with this too, suggesting the Anunnaki introduced beer making to humans as a way to pacify the workforce, keeping them content with their lot through mild intoxication. The careful regulation of beer production and distribution supposedly shows systematic management of a control substance. It's a theory that transforms religion into a social engineering project and beer into a tool of population management, which is both absurdly cynical and kind of hilarious. The mainstream interpretation that humans discovered fermentation naturally and developed beer through experimentation, then incorporated it into religious practice because the Sumerians incorporated everything into religious practice, is considerably less dramatic but probably more accurate. We're deep into the second section now, exploring the economic and administrative dimensions of the Anunnaki settlement pattern, seeing how the divine cities functioned as actual urban centers with complex economies, social hierarchies, and daily rhythms. Whether you interpret these cities as religious centers that accumulated secular power or as resource extraction facilities disguised as temples, the archaeological and textual evidence provides remarkable detail about how they operated. The tablets speak across millennia, preserving ordinary moments and extraordinary claims, mundane transactions and cosmic mythologies, giving us windows into a vanished world that somehow feels immediately human despite its alien antiquity. The afternoon heat finally breaks, storm clouds gathering to the north, promising rain that will be either blessing or disaster depending on how much falls and how fast. The Mesopotamians viewed weather as divine communication. Thunder is Ishkum's voice, rain is Adad's gift or punishment, storms express divine displeasure or power. Every natural phenomenon carries meaning, slots into the cosmic order, reveals something about the god's intentions. It's a worldview where nothing is random, everything is significant, and the universe is alive with divine presence and purpose. You're getting drowsy now, the voice of history blending with the imagined sounds of ancient Nippur, the heat and dust and river smell and chanting priests and marketplace noise all washing over you in gentle waves, carrying you deeper into rest. The Anunnaki settlement pattern sprawls across your mind's eye like a map of stars, each city a point of light, together forming a constellation of civilization on the Mesopotamian plain. And whether those points represent organic urban development or planned extraterrestrial installations doesn't matter quite so much as you drift, because the story itself is the gift, the connection across time is the magic, and sleep is approaching on soft feet. The moon rises over Uruk, its silver light transforming the ziggurat into a ghostly mountain, all shadows and pale surfaces, otherworldly and beautiful in equal measure. We've moved forward again, now approaching 2100 BCE, the Earthray period when the Sumerian civilization reaches its administrative zenith under the third dynasty of Ur. This is the era of hyper-organization, when bureaucratic record-keeping reaches almost absurd levels of detail, when the state controls massive labor forces through careful accounting, when the Anunnaki settlement pattern has been formalized into an official religious geography that underpins political authority across the region. The tablets from this period number in the tens of thousands, tracking everything from individual sheep to construction projects employing thousands of workers, creating a documentary archive of extraordinary richness. Uruk itself is magnificent, one of the largest cities in the world at this time, home to perhaps 50,000 people or more, its walls legendary enough to feature in the Epic of Gilgamesh as a wonder worthy of eternal fame. The city sprawls across the landscape, its residential district spreading far beyond the temple precinct, though even from the outskirts the great ziggurat of Inanna dominates the view, drawing eyes upward, asserting the goddess's presence over her domain. Inanna, goddess of love and war, sex and violence, beauty and destruction, she embodies paradox and passion, and her cult was wild and powerful, featuring sacred prostitution, ecstatic rituals, gender-crossing priests, and festivals that celebrated both creation and chaos. The settlement pattern by this period is fully mature. Each major Anunnaki deity has their primary cult center, their earthly house where they reside and receive worship. But the pattern is more complex than simple one god, one city. There are subsidiary temples in other cities, creating a network of religious sites that tie the region together theologically and economically. Enlil's main temple is at Nippur, but shrines to Enlil exist in Uruk, and other cities, receiving their own offerings and maintaining their own staffs. The gods share territory while maintaining primary residences, and the political implications are significant. Controlling multiple cult centers means commanding religious legitimacy across a wider area. Here's a mainstream historical fact that illustrates the interconnection beautifully. The kings of the Ur-III dynasty styled themselves as King of Sumer and Akkad, claiming authority over the whole Mesopotamian region, and they expressed this political unity through religious means. They rebuilt temples across the realm, left inscriptions at major cult centers, sent offerings to all significant gods, and created a religious administration that linked the entire network of sacred sites into a coherent system. The Anunnaki settlement pattern became a political tool, with control of the major cult centers conferring legitimacy on whoever held them. Ur-Nammu and his successors poured resources into temple construction and renovation, demonstrating both piety and power, binding the gods to the dynasty through lavish devotion. Alternative researchers see coordinated management of the Anunnaki installation network. The Ur-III kings weren't just politically ambitious humans, they were executing a plan on behalf of, or in collaboration with, the Anunnaki themselves, maintaining the extraterrestrial facilities across the region, ensuring all sites remained functional and properly staffed. The intensive building programs supposedly reflect ongoing Anunnaki needs for upgraded facilities, and the religious administration was actually a management structure for coordinating operations across multiple locations. Every political development has an extraterrestrial explanation that transforms kings into administrators and temples into facilities. Walking through Uruk at night is an experience that blends the familiar and the strange. The streets are mostly empty after dark, the sensible people having gone home, but you can hear sounds through the mud brick walls, conversations, laughter, someone singing a lullaby, the inevitable crying of infants who haven't yet learned to sleep through the night and won't for another few thousand years because some things really are eternal. Oil lamps flicker in some windows, luxury items that not everyone can afford. Most people simply go to sleep when the sun sets because there's not much point in staying awake in the dark. The stars overhead are brilliant, unpolluted by artificial light. The Milky Way, a river of stars flowing across the sky, the same celestial vista the Sumerians observed and mapped with impressive accuracy. The Mesopotamian astronomers tracked celestial movements with mathematical precision, creating tables predicting lunar and planetary positions far into the future. They recognized that celestial patterns repeated in regular cycles and used this knowledge for both astrological prediction and calendar regulation. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa records observations of Venus's appearances and disappearances over a 21-year period, data precise enough that modern astronomers can use it to help date Babylonian chronology. This wasn't casual stargazing, this was systematic data collection and mathematical analysis pursued across generations. Why did the Mesopotamians care so much about celestial phenomena? Mainstream answer: they believed celestial movements reflected divine will and affected earthly events, so tracking the heavens was essential for understanding what the gods had planned. Astrology and astronomy were inseparable, both serving the goal of reading cosmic patterns to anticipate the future. The mathematical sophistication developed to serve religious and political purposes, with astronomical knowledge controlled by temple scribes who held the keys to understanding divine communication through celestial signs. Alternative answer: the Anunnaki came from the heavens and maintained interest in celestial phenomena for navigational or communication reasons, so they taught humans astronomy to serve Anunnaki purposes. The precise observations were necessary for tracking the Anunnaki home planet Nibiru's orbit or for maintaining contact with other extraterrestrial locations. Human astronomers were trained assistants in a larger project, and their mathematical achievements represent learned knowledge from advanced teachers rather than independent development. It's a theory that robs humans of credit for their accomplishments, attributing all innovation to alien instruction, which seems both unnecessary and kind of insulting to ancient human intelligence. The Temple of Inanna rises before us, its facade decorated with ceramic cones pressed into the mud brick to create geometric patterns, their glazed surfaces catching moonlight and creating an effect of shimmering texture. The decorative technique required enormous labor, individually pressing thousands of cone-shaped ceramic pieces into wet plaster. But the visual result is stunning, transforming a simple mud brick wall into an artwork that proclaims both wealth and devotion. Inanna deserves beauty, deserves magnificence, deserves the finest work human hands can produce. Or alternatively, the Anunnaki facility needed proper finishing, and the decorative program served functional purposes we don't understand while also impressing the local population with displays of controlled resources. There's a scholarly debate about whether the Sumerian pantheon was originally more fluid and localized, with deities that only later became standardized across the region through political unification and textual canonization. Some researchers argue that each city had its own gods that only gradually merged with deities from other cities as the region became more integrated, while others maintain that the major Anunnaki were always pan-Mesopotamian figures, even if their cult centers remained localized. The textual evidence is complex, with some gods appearing early and widely while others seem more regionally specific in early periods before becoming widespread later. This debate doesn't particularly interest the alternative researchers because they've already decided the Anunnaki were actual beings, so questions about theological development seem beside the point. If the gods were real extraterrestrials, then the pantheon reflects the actual population of alien visitors, and regional variations just show which Anunnaki preferred which locations. The theological evolution that mainstream scholars trace becomes irrelevant when you're treating myths as garbled history rather than as evolving religious concepts. It's a fundamental difference in approach. Scholars study religious ideas as ideas, while alternative researchers treat religious texts as imperfect records of actual events. Inside the temple complex, the night rituals are beginning. Priests and priestesses, purified through ritual bathing, dressed in clean linen, their heads shaved or carefully groomed depending on their specific roles, move through the courtyards carrying offerings to Inanna's inner sanctum where her cult statue resides. The goddess's image is carved wood covered in gold leaf, dressed in fine fabrics, adorned with jewelry, given food and drink daily as if she were physically present and hungry, which, in the Sumerian worldview, she is. The statue isn't merely a representation of Inanna, it is Inanna in her material form, her earthly body through which she interacts with the mortal realm. The ritual feeding of divine statues was serious business, conducted with elaborate ceremony and careful attention to proper procedures. The gods must be fed quality food, appropriate to their status, prepared by ritually pure personnel, presented with correct prayers and gestures. Neglect the gods and they'll abandon their cities, withdrawing their protective presence and leaving humans vulnerable to chaos and disaster. The offerings aren't symbolic gestures, they're essential maintenance of the divine human contract, the service humans owe in exchange for cosmic order and divine protection. Or, in the alternative interpretation, the offerings represent tribute paid to the resident Anunnaki who literally consumed high-quality food because they were actual beings with actual appetites. The ritual purity requirements supposedly reflect contamination concerns for advanced beings interacting with primitive humans. The elaborate ceremonies were established protocols for approaching the Anunnaki safely, and the whole religious apparatus was a management system making humans willing providers of resources to their extraterrestrial overlords. Every ritual detail is reinterpreted through a materialist lens that strips away the sacred and replaces it with the transactional. A priestess of Inanna walks past, her head held high, her eyes lined with kohl, her bearing radiating authority. The priestesses of Inanna held significant social power, controlling temple resources, performing sacred rites, sometimes engaging in temple prostitution as a religious practice that honored the goddess of sexuality. Modern sensibilities struggle with the concept of sacred prostitution, but in the Sumerian context, sexuality was divine gift and power, not something shameful. Inanna's priestesses embodied the goddess's nature, and sexual union in the temple precinct was sacrament not sin, worship not transgression. Alternative researchers have speculated extensively about sacred prostitution, suggesting it served Anunnaki reproductive purposes, that the extraterrestrials interbred with human temple prostitutes to maintain genetic experiments, or simply because they found humans attractive. The biblical Nephilim, sons of God, who mated with human women, get pulled into this interpretation as further evidence of Anunnaki-human sexual relationships. It's speculative piled on speculative, mixing Sumerian temple practices with biblical mythology and ancient astronaut theory into a cocktail that professional scholars find profoundly unconvincing, but that makes for interesting late-night speculation. The settlement pattern across the Mesopotamian plain shows interesting clustering in certain areas and notable gaps in others. The major cities concentrate in the southern alluvial plain where irrigation agriculture flourishes, while the northern regions support different settlement patterns. The marshlands of the far south supported distinct cultures, and the mountain foothills to the north and east had their own urban traditions. The Anunnaki cult cities specifically occupy the irrigated agricultural heartland, positioned to control and benefit from the region's most productive farming areas. Mainstream interpretation: cities develop where agriculture can support large populations, so naturally, the urban centers cluster in the best agricultural zones. The settlement pattern follows environmental and economic logic, with human decisions about where to live shaped by practical considerations about resource access, transportation routes, and defensive positions. Alternative interpretation: the Anunnaki chose locations in the most productive agricultural regions because they needed the food production to support their population and their human workforce. The settlement pattern reflects planned resource extraction, positioning facilities to optimize control over agricultural output. The gaps in the pattern represent areas without resources the Anunnaki needed, or areas environmentally unsuitable for their purposes. Both interpretations account for the same spatial distribution. They just disagree about who made the location decisions and why. Interestingly, archaeological survey data actually supports the mainstream view quite well, showing that settlement density correlates strongly with agricultural potential and that cities tend to appear where environmental conditions favor intensive farming. But correlation doesn't determine causation direction, so the alternative interpreters can always argue their model explains the same pattern. The temple school is dark and quiet now, but during the day, it bustles with students learning cuneiform writing, mathematics, Sumerian literature, and professional skills for scribal careers. The curriculum was standardized, with students progressing through set sequences of texts, copying and memorizing standard works, learning first simple signs, then complex ones, then whole compositions. We have student practice tablets showing mistakes, corrections, repeated attempts to master difficult passages. We have teacher texts with model answers. We have graduation exercises demonstrating achieved competency. The Sumerian educational system was sophisticated and systematic, producing literate professionals who maintained the administrative apparatus of civilization. Some alternative researchers suggest the scribal schools were Anunnaki knowledge transmission centers, teaching humans the information and skills the extraterrestrials wanted preserved and propagated. The standardized curriculum supposedly reflects Anunnaki control over what knowledge humans could access, and the scribal profession was a carefully managed class of human intermediaries between the Anunnaki and general population. It transforms education into indoctrination, turns schools into propaganda centers, and makes teachers into unwitting agents of alien control, which seems like a lot of conspiracy for what might just be a reasonable civilization developing literacy and professional training. A dog wanders through the temple courtyard, probably hoping for scraps from the offering tables. Dogs in ancient Mesopotamia were working animals, hunting dogs, guard dogs, sheep dogs, but they were also just dogs, begging for food and scratching fleas and being generally dog-like across the millennia. This particular dog is a street dog, not belonging to anyone specifically but tolerated around the temple because it keeps the rodent population down and occasionally receives food from sympathetic priests. The dog doesn't ponder the Anunnaki settlement pattern or alternative historical interpretations. The dog seeks food, shelter, and the occasional scratch behind the ears, living fully in the present moment in a way that honestly seems quite pleasant. The ziggurat of Uruk, like all ziggurats, functions as a cosmic mountain, a structure linking earth to heaven, providing a high place where gods and humans can meet. The architecture creates sacred space, transforming flat landscape into dimensional symbolism where ascending levels represent ascending closer to divine realm. At the ziggurat's top sits a small shrine where the god might descend to meet specially chosen priests, though access is tightly restricted because not just anyone can approach the divine realm and expect to survive the encounter. The whole structure is theology in brick, cosmology made architectural, belief rendered as physical space you can actually climb, or it's an elevated platform providing visibility and communication advantages for the Anunnaki, a launch or landing structure for their craft, or a facility whose actual purpose we can't understand because we lack the technological context. Alternative interpretations of ziggurat function vary wildly, but they share the assumption that these massive structures served practical rather than religious purposes, that the sacred space explanation is cover story for actual function. The problem, of course, is that without evidence of the proposed alternative functions, these theories are just speculation based on rejecting the obvious religious interpretation that fits all available evidence. We're past the midpoint of our third section now, deep into exploration of how the Anunnaki settlement pattern manifested across the physical landscape, how the divine geography mapped onto actual territory, how belief and place intertwined to create sacred space. Whether you're imagining ancient religious devotion or extraterrestrial resource extraction, the sites themselves remain, archaeological layers testifying to thousands of years of occupation, temple foundations still visible, tablet archives preserving voices from vanished centuries. The stones don't care about our interpretations. They simply endure, patient and silent, waiting for each generation to construct meaning from their mute testimony. The night deepens. The moon climbs higher, and the city settles into quieter rhythms. Somewhere a baby cries, somewhere lovers whisper, somewhere an old person lies awake, reviewing their long life, wondering what comes next, finding comfort or fear in their beliefs about the afterlife and the God's judgment. Human concerns haven't changed much in 4,000 years. We still worry about resources, relationships, meaning, mortality. The Sumerians just happened to frame these eternal questions in terms of Anunnaki and ziggurats and cuneiform tablets, their answers no less valid than ours despite the very different cultural context. The final light of evening fades completely now, and we'll rest here a moment before moving forward through time again, letting the sounds and smells and sights of Uruk at night settle into your mind, creating a vivid dream space where ancient and modern blur together, where you can almost hear the priests chanting and the dogs barking and the river flowing eternal just beyond the city walls, carrying all our stories downstream toward the sea where they dissolve into salt and mystery and the vast forgetting that waits for every civilization, every story, every carefully pressed cuneiform tablet eventually weathered back into anonymous dust. The morning sun illuminates the ruins of Babylon, and we've jumped far forward now, to around 1750 BCE, the old Babylonian period when Hammurabi has built his empire and Marduk has risen to supremacy in the Mesopotamian pantheon, supplanting the ancient Anunnaki hierarchy with Babylon's patron god as the new king of heaven. The settlement pattern has evolved, political power has shifted northward, and the old Sumerian cities, while still sacred, no longer dominate politically as they once did. But the pattern persists. The major cult centers remain active, their temples still central to religious and economic life, the Anunnaki still revered even as theological emphasis shifts toward Babylonian supremacy. Babylon itself is magnificent. Its famous walls thick enough to drive chariots along their tops, its Ishtar Gate decorated with glazed brick reliefs of lions, bulls and dragons in brilliant blue and gold. The city's ziggurat, the Anunnaki, would later inspire the biblical Tower of Babel story, though the actual structure is an impressively engineered religious building, not a hubristic attempt to invade heaven. It rises in 7 levels, each painted a different color representing different celestial spheres, creating a rainbow of sacred architecture that must have been absolutely stunning when the glazed bricks caught the morning light. Here's a mainstream fact about this period. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest and most complete legal codes, invokes divine authority for its laws. The famous stele shows Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, establishing that legal authority flows from divine source through the king to human society. The laws cover everything from property rights to personal injury to family relations, establishing standard penalties and procedures that apply across Hammurabi's empire. It's a remarkable document showing sophisticated legal thinking and the use of written law to create social order across diverse populations. The code's prologue emphasizes that the gods chose Hammurabi to bring justice to the land, to protect the weak from the strong, to make righteousness prevail. The Anunnaki are invoked as witnesses to the king's legitimacy, even though by this period Marduk has been elevated above them in Babylonian theology. The divine council still functions, still oversees cosmic order, but Marduk now leads it, having defeated the chaos dragon Tiamat and created the world from her corpse, a mythological coup that justifies Babylon's political dominance by giving its god credit for creation itself. Alternative researchers interpret Hammurabi's code as evidence that the Anunnaki established legal systems for managing human society according to their requirements. The laws supposedly reflect Anunnaki's sense of justice and order, taught to human rulers to create stable conditions for continued resource extraction and population management. Hammurabi wasn't receiving divine inspiration. He was implementing policies designed by the extraterrestrial overlords to maintain control. Every law is reinterpreted as population management, every penalty as behavioral conditioning, the whole legal structure as sophisticated social engineering by advanced beings manipulating primitive humans. The scholarly debate about the relationship between Hammurabi's code and earlier Sumerian law codes is genuinely interesting. The Code of Ur-Nammu predates Hammurabi by about 3 centuries, and there are clear continuities between them, suggesting legal tradition rather than divine revelation. Did Hammurabi innovate or compile? Did he build on established legal principles or create new ones? How much of the code reflects actual practice versus ideal standards? These are legitimate historical questions with evidence-based arguments on various sides. But they're completely irrelevant if you've decided the laws came from extraterrestrials, because then the question becomes how the Anunnaki evolved their management policies between Ur-Nammu's time and Hammurabi's. The scholarly debate about human legal development is replaced with speculation about alien governance strategies, which might be more fun to think about but has zero evidential support beyond "I choose to interpret these texts this way." Walking through Babylon in its prime is an experience of power made architectural. Everything about the city proclaims strength, wealth, organization, and divine favor. The streets are relatively straight and organized compared to the organic tangle of older Sumerian cities, showing urban planning on a grand scale. The palace complex is enormous, containing hundreds of rooms, including the famous Hanging Gardens, though whether those gardens actually existed in Babylon or are confused with gardens in another city remains debated. The temples are lavishly decorated, their revenues supporting thousands of priests, servants, craftsmen, and dependents. The Asagila, Marduk's temple, dominates the sacred precinct. Its name means house with the raised head, and it certainly lives up to that designation, rising high and proud, proclaiming Marduk's supremacy over all other gods. The temple complex includes not just the main sanctuary, but numerous subsidiary buildings, workshops, storage facilities, administrative offices, schools, and residential quarters for temple personnel. It's essentially a small city within the city, a self-contained economic and religious unit controlling vast resources. The temple architecture across Mesopotamia shows interesting regularities in layout and orientation. The main sanctuary typically faces east toward the rising sun. The ziggurat usually stands in its own courtyard, separated from but connected to the main temple building. Subsidiary shrines occupy defined positions within the complex. Storage and administrative buildings cluster in specific areas. There's a template, a pattern that repeats across different cities and periods, with local variations, but clear underlying consistency. Mainstream interpretation. This architectural consistency reflects shared religious beliefs and construction traditions passing between cities and generations. The builders followed established models because those models effectively created appropriate sacred space. And why reinvent what works? The regularities show cultural continuity and the spread of architectural knowledge through professional networks of priests and builders. Alternative interpretation. The architectural consistency reflects standardized design for Anunnaki facilities across the region. Each installation followed the same basic plan because they served the same purposes and required the same functional elements. The orientation and layout supposedly optimize the facilities for purposes we can only guess at: energy collection, communication arrays, dimensional gateways, whatever function the alternative researcher wants to propose. The consistency proves planning by a single intelligence rather than independent human development. The problem with the alternative interpretation is that it explains architectural similarity by proposing mechanisms that require assuming facts not in evidence. Yes, the temples share design elements, but we know humans share design elements across time and space through cultural transmission, while we don't know that extraterrestrials use dimensional gateways or require specific architectural orientations for energy collection. The conventional explanation relies on known mechanisms of cultural diffusion. The alternative explanation requires hypothesizing unknown technologies and purposes. Occam's razor suggests going with the explanation that doesn't require inventing entirely new categories of phenomena. A merchant caravan is departing Babylon, carrying trade goods to distant lands. Fine textiles, metalwork, carved cylinder seals, cuneiform tablets containing everything from religious texts to mathematical treatises to love poetry. Mesopotamian civilization exports not just material goods but also ideas, techniques, and cultural innovations. The cuneiform writing system spreads to other languages. Mathematical techniques influence neighboring cultures. Mythological themes appear in modified form across the ancient Near East. Cultural exchange flows in multiple directions, creating a web of influence and interaction spanning from Egypt to the Indus Valley. Some alternative researchers suggest these trade networks followed routes established by the Anunnaki for their own purposes, connecting important sites in a larger extraterrestrial infrastructure. The spread of cuneiform supposedly facilitated Anunnaki communication with human proxies across wide areas. The cultural similarities between distant civilizations reflect Anunnaki influence on multiple human populations simultaneously. Every instance of cultural exchange is reinterpreted as evidence of centralized extraterrestrial management rather than normal human contact and diffusion. It's a profoundly top-down view of history that denies agency to ancient humans, attributing all innovation and development to alien intervention. It assumes humans were essentially passive recipients of extraterrestrial knowledge rather than creative, intelligent beings capable of independent innovation. It's also, frankly, kind of boring because it replaces the rich complexity of cultural evolution with a simple explanation: aliens did it. The mainstream historical narrative, with its interplay of environmental factors, human creativity, social organization, cultural exchange, and historical contingency, is actually more interesting because it recognizes the genuine achievements of our ancestors. The Babylonian astronomers continue the work of their Sumerian predecessors, tracking celestial movements with mathematical precision, creating predictive tables of extraordinary accuracy. The Emul-Apin tablets catalogue stars and constellations, recording rising times and astronomical periods. The Enuma Anu Enlil is a massive compendium of celestial omens, 70 tablets containing thousands of entries correlating astronomical phenomena with earthly events. This is systematic observation pursued across generations, data accumulation on a scale that requires institutional continuity and dedicated specialists. Why this intense astronomical focus? Mainstream answer: the Mesopotamians believed celestial phenomena communicated divine will, so understanding the heavens was essential for anticipating the gods' intentions and human fortunes. Astronomy served astrological prediction, which served political and religious purposes. the mathematical sophistication developed in service of reading cosmic signs. Alternative answer: the Anunnaki came from the stars and maintained interest in celestial phenomena for navigational or communication purposes related to their homeworld. Human astronomers were trained to assist with tracking Nibiru's orbit or maintaining other functions of extraterrestrial importance. The knowledge was taught by the Anunnaki rather than independently developed, explaining its sophisticated mathematics and systematic observation. The alternative answer has a particular problem. If the Anunnaki were so technologically advanced, why would they need human astronomers tracking planets with naked eye observations? Wouldn't they have instruments vastly superior to human vision? Why teach humans astronomy at all if the Anunnaki had their own superior methods? The theory requires the extraterrestrials to be simultaneously vastly advanced and dependent on primitive human observation, which seems contradictory unless you propose additional sub-theories to explain the contradiction. A scholar walks past, carrying a tablet that he's consulting frequently, his lips moving as he silently reads the text. Literacy was never universal in ancient Mesopotamia. It was a specialized skill requiring years of training, and most people conducted their business through scribes who read and wrote on their behalf. But for those who could read, an entire world opened: access to literature, history, religious texts, scientific knowledge, legal documents, administrative records. The library at Nineveh, assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal centuries after our current period, would contain tens of thousands of tablets covering every area of Mesopotamian knowledge. The Great Library at Alexandria gets all the fame, but Ashurbanipal's library predated it and preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost forever. The Anunnaki settlement pattern by this Babylonian period has been integrated into a larger political and religious system. The old Sumerian cult cities remain sacred, their temples still receive royal patronage, but Babylon has eclipsed them in political importance. Marduk's elevation to cosmic kingship represents Babylon's assertion of supremacy, rewriting the mythology to justify political reality. The creation myth Enuma Elish describes Marduk defeating Tiamat and creating the world, establishing Babylon as the cosmic center, the omphalos where heaven and earth connect. It's theology serving politics, religion reinforcing power. Or it's the record of actual conflict between Anunnaki factions, with Marduk's rise reflecting real shifts in power among the extraterrestrials. The mythological combat supposedly preserves memories of actual warfare using advanced weapons that seemed magical to human observers. Tiamat wasn't a chaos dragon, she was a rival Anunnaki faction, or perhaps an artificial construct, and her defeat by Marduk represents technological combat misunderstood by humans who lacked context to understand what they witnessed. Every mythological element is reinterpreted as garbled history, with the mythic imagination stripped away to reveal supposed historical events underneath. The sunset from Babylon's walls is spectacular, the whole western sky turning colors that range from gold to crimson to deep purple, the light catching the glazed bricks and making the whole city seem to glow. It must have been an incredible sight, this city of wonders reflecting the dying sun's glory, proclaiming human achievement and divine favor in equal measure. The builders who constructed this place, the craftsmen who created its decorations, the administrators who organized its complex economy, the farmers who fed its population, all were humans using human intelligence and human labor to create something magnificent. That achievement deserves recognition on its own terms, not attribution to extraterrestrial intervention. The night watch begins their rounds, guards moving through the streets to maintain order and watch for fire, which is a constant danger in a city of mud brick and wooden roofs and oil lamps. The protocols are established, the procedures clear, the penalties for failure severe because the safety of the city depends on vigilance. Everything in Mesopotamian society has its proper procedure, its established method, its correct form. Order is valued above almost everything else because the alternative is chaos. And chaos means crop failure, invasion, flood, famine, death. The Anunnaki promise order in exchange for service, and the bargain seems fair when the alternative is terrifying. We're approaching the end of our fourth section, having traced the Anunnaki settlement pattern from its origins through its mature development to its integration into later political structures. The pattern persists through changing dynasties and shifting power centers. The cult cities maintaining their sacred status, even as political authority moves from place to place. Whether you understand this as religious geography reflecting human beliefs or as an extraterrestrial installation network maintained across millennia, the archaeological reality remains. The sites were real, the temples were built, the texts were written, and all of it survived long enough for us to study and interpret and argue about, and, in this particular case, use as soothing bedtime content while you drift towards sleep, the ancient world fading like a dream already half forgotten, leaving only the impression of sun-baked mud brick and river reeds and the vast Mesopotamian sky. And now, we arrive at the quiet ending of our journey, the gentle settling that comes after exploration, when all the details we've gathered resolve into reflections and summary, when the ancient world releases its hold and we return to the present moment, to your comfortable bed, to the peaceful dark surrounding you, to the simple need for rest that connects you with every human who ever lived, including those long-dead Sumerians who also needed sleep after their long days in the sun. The Anunnaki settlement pattern across Mesopotamia, whether we interpret it as religious geography, or extraterrestrial installation network, or some combination that accommodates multiple perspectives, represents one of humanity's earliest attempts to organize space according to meaning, to map belief onto landscape, to create places where heaven and earth could touch, the temples rising from the flat plain, the ziggurats climbing toward the sky, the careful distribution of cult centers across the region. All of it speaks to a profound human need to structure chaos into cosmos, to create order from the formless possibility of existence. The mainstream interpretation that understands these sites as organic urban developments centered on religious institutions has the advantage of fitting all available evidence without requiring speculative additions. We know humans build cities where resources allow. We know religions develop complex mythologies and institutional structures. We know temples accumulate wealth and power and become economic engines. We know cultural evolution produces sophisticated civilizations through gradual accumulation of innovations. Every element of the conventional explanation relies on demonstrated human capacities and known historical processes. The alternative interpretation that reads these same sites as extraterrestrial facilities requires us to accept propositions for which we lack direct evidence, that advanced aliens visited Earth in antiquity, that they genetically engineered humans, that they established resource extraction operations disguised as religious centers, that ancient texts preserve garbled memories of these interactions. None of this is impossible in an absolute sense, but none of it is necessary to explain the evidence we actually have. The ancient astronaut theory adds speculative layers that don't improve explanatory power while requiring us to ignore expert linguistic and archaeological analysis. Yet there's something appealing about the alternative interpretations, something that draws people despite scholarly rejection. Perhaps it's the desire for connection to something larger, some cosmic significance beyond our small planet. Perhaps it's the comfort of thinking our ancestors weren't alone, that powerful beings took interest in human development. Perhaps it's simply more exciting to imagine alien intervention than to acknowledge the slower, messier reality of cultural evolution. The appeal is real, even if the historical accuracy is questionable. What both interpretations share, interestingly, is respect for the Sumerian achievement itself. Whether you think humans built civilization independently or with extraterrestrial assistance, you're acknowledging that something remarkable happened in ancient Mesopotamia. Cities rose, writing developed, mathematics flourished, literature was created, laws were codified, astronomy advanced. The Sumerians left an extraordinary legacy that influences us still. Our hours and minutes, our degrees of arc, our mathematical principles, our legal concepts, our literary forms. That legacy deserves recognition and study regardless of how we explain its origins. As you drift towards sleep now, let the ancient world fade into comfortable abstraction. The details don't need to be retained. They're not a test you'll take tomorrow. They're simply a vehicle for transition, a way of occupying your mind with something interesting enough to hold attention but not so urgent it prevents relaxation. The Anunnaki can be gods or aliens or metaphors or all three simultaneously in the soft logic of approaching dreams, where contradictions coexist peacefully and rigid categories dissolve into fluid possibility. The rivers still flow in Iraq, the Tigris and Euphrates carrying water from the mountains to the sea as they have for millions of years, indifferent to human civilization rising and falling along their banks. The ancient cities are mostly ruins now, archaeological sites where patient excavation reveals layer upon layer of occupation, each generation building on the remains of the previous, creating tells, artificial hills of accumulated debris and reconstruction that testify to the stubborn human insistence on occupying the same sacred spots across vast stretches of time. If you visit these sites today, you see fragments, broken walls, eroded ziggurats, scattered tablets, partial inscriptions. The glory has faded, the gods are silent, the priests are dust, but the sites still carry power, still speak across the centuries to those willing to listen. Standing in the ruins of Uruk or or Eridu, you connect with the humans who built these places, who worshipped here, who conducted business and raised families and dreamed dreams not so different from your own. The connection is real, even if our interpretations of the surviving evidence diverge wildly. The tablets that preserve Anunnaki stories survived not through any particular magic, but through the simple durability of baked clay. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis, countless hymns and prayers and incantations and king lists and economic records, all pressed into clay, all baked hard, all waiting patiently in the earth for discovery. We're privileged to live in an era when these texts have been recovered, translated, made accessible. We can read Sumerian literature, study their mathematics, understand their religious beliefs, see their world through their own words. Previous generations lacked this access, and future generations may have lost it again, which makes our current moment precious. The search for meaning in ancient texts is eternal and probably irresolvable. Every generation reads the past through its own concerns, finding in ancient stories reflections of contemporary anxieties and hopes. The Victorians found moral lessons, the modernists found alienation, the postmodernists found constructed narratives. Our era, with its technological sophistication and space exploration, finds ancient astronauts and genetic engineering. Future generations will find whatever they need to find, interpreting the same evidence through different frameworks, creating new meanings from old materials. And that's okay. The texts can bear multiple interpretations. The Anunnaki can be gods and aliens and metaphors simultaneously, existing in different forms for different readers, serving different purposes, answering different needs. What matters is engaging with the material respectfully, acknowledging expert knowledge while remaining open to wonder, balancing skepticism with imagination, finding the sweet spot between credulity and dismissiveness. As sleep approaches, your breathing deepens naturally, your body relaxes incrementally, your mind releases its grip on waking consciousness. The Anunnaki settlement pattern blurs into abstract geometry, points of light scattered across darkness, a constellation of meaning waiting for interpretation. Whether those points represent temples or facilities or simply human achievement doesn't matter quite so much now as you drift, because interpretation is a daytime activity, and night calls for release, for surrender to the body's need for rest and restoration. The ancient Sumerians understood something we sometimes forget, that rest is sacred, that sleep is necessary, that even the gods require their offerings and quiet moments. The temples closed at night, the sacred precincts fell silent, the eternal flame burned unwatched. The gods presumably slept, or at least rested, modeling for humans the necessary rhythm of activity and repose. Even in a cosmic hierarchy, rest has its place. So rest now, comfortable in your bed, safe in your home, connected across vast time to all the humans who sought meaning in the stars and built monuments to their beliefs and pressed their thoughts into clay, hoping to be remembered. You are remembered, ancient Sumerians. Your cities endure as ruins, your tablets as museum pieces, your stories as bedtime narratives for seekers of gentle sleep. You created something that outlasted your civilization, your language, your gods. You created stories that still speak, still resonate, still carry meaning across 4,000 years of change. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may you sleep as peacefully as the ancient gods in their temples, as deeply as the rivers carve their patient channels, as contentedly as those who need no answers, only rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.